Thanks for that really nice introduction. Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you from my home office here in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to tell you about, looks like the slides got completely messed up, but we'll soldier through that. Uh, we, I'm interested to tell you about the latest batch of research having to do with this emotion of regret. Regret. I want to tell you some of the things that I learned. It's less about how to nudge people than it is about what's going on, what makes people tick, that gives us some insight into how and why to nudge them. So, regret is a terrible feeling. It's that stomach churning feeling that the present would be better and the future brighter if only, and that's the key catchphrase for regret, if only you hadn't chosen so poorly, decided so wrongly, or acted so stupidly in the past. Now, we have this philosophy, not only here in America, but I think throughout the world, that regret is inherently bad for us, that we should be positive, not negative, that we should look forward, not backward. I have in this latest book, oodles of people from Portugal, from Brazil, from the United States with tattoos that say no regrets, who believe in this philosophy so deeply that regret is harmful, that they enshrine that belief on their body. And so before I get into the main part of what I want to talk about today, I want to try to recalibrate very quickly your understanding of this profoundly misunderstood emotion. This is an emotion that scientists have been studying for 50 or 60 years. Social psychologists, especially developmental psychologists, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists have been studying this emotion. And one of the things that they've come up with two key points here that I want to highlight for you. Two key points. Good Lord. Two key points that I want to highlight for you. The first one is this: that regret makes us human. Regret makes us human. This is an incredibly important point, that everybody has regrets. Everybody has regrets. The only people without regrets truly are 5-year-olds, because their brains haven't developed the cognitive capacity to experience regret. It requires a great deal of muscularity and dexterity in our brains, and 5-year-olds just don't have that yet. So who doesn't really have regrets? 5-year-olds don't have regrets. People with brain damage don't have regrets, and sociopaths don't have regrets. Everybody else has regrets. There's research in social psychology showing that it's one of the most common emotions that human beings have. It's arguably the most common negative emotion that human beings express. And so this is kind of puzzling, right? You have this emotion that is ubiquitous, and yet it's very unpleasant. It's aversive, and yet it's everywhere. And that raises the question: why? Are we self-sabotaging? Are we miswired in some way? And the answer is absolutely not. The second thing we know about regret is that, done right, regret makes us better. Regret makes us better. Regret makes us human. It's widespread, but it makes us better. The reason this aversive emotion is so ubiquitous is because it's useful. If we treat it right, we shouldn't be ignoring our regrets. We shouldn't be wallowing in our regrets. We should be confronting our regrets, dealing with our regrets systematically. And when we do that, when we take that third way between ignoring and wallowing, there's an array of benefits. Again, there's a pile of research showing this, that it can help make us better negotiators. It can help us solve problems faster and better. It can help us avoid cognitive biases, like escalation of commitment to a failing course of action or confirmation bias. It can help us become better strategists. It can help us get greater meaning in our lives. That when we actually invite this aversive emotion in a systematic way, we can use it as an engine for going forward. So that's my very quick recalibration of our understanding of regret. What I want to move to now is the question of, what do people regret? What do people regret? Because I think that gives us some insights. Now, scholars have been looking at this question for the last 20 years. In 2005, there was a meta-analysis of previous studies of regret that asked these studies asked people, what do they regret? Probe that question of what do people regret? And this meta-analysis from 2005 looked at all of these studies and said, hey, okay, here's an assessment of what people regret. So let's go to the next. I apologize for these slides, folks. They're profoundly and deeply messed up. So let me talk you. I'm really sorry about that. The slides are profoundly and deeply messed up. But let me talk you through them. I'm contemplating abandoning them in a moment here. So here's what we know about what people regret. The initial studies from 2005 showed that that the biggest regret that people had was education. So the top regret was education. The second regret was career. And the third regret was romance. Then they realized that this meta-analysis, the underlying studies that they were looking at, all came from college campuses. And so, not surprisingly, that when in a college campus, education is in the air, and therefore education might be the largest regret. So in 2011, Neil Rose and Mike Morrison did a random digit dialing survey of the US population to get more systematically understand what people actually regret. So in the first instance, in the meta-analysis, it was education, career, and romance. In the second analysis, when they actually did a random survey, what they found was that romance now was number one, family was number two, career was number three, and education was a distant fourth. Now, very confusing. I decided to take on this project myself. So I put together the largest public opinion survey of American attitudes of regret ever conducted. And I looked at a sample of 4,489 respondents. So we put together, we're working with Qualtrics, a really, really fantastic sample of the US population, using a very large sample so we could stratify to represent the glorious diversity of the United States. And what I found, again, remember, previously it was education, career, and romance. Then it was romance, family, and career. What I found was it's all over the place. People had family regrets, as you can tell in this profoundly messed up, you can't tell in this profoundly messed up chart. People had family regrets. People had regrets about partners. And it was all over the place. And so we have this perplexing thing that when we ask people what they regret and have them slotted into categories, we don't actually derive any important insights. Now, there was a way that I tried to crack this nut, or sort of inadvertently crack this nut. And what I did is I put together something else, not only a quantitative survey, but a qualitative survey. Now, I know with this group, we can get into some of the methodological weeds here. We can get into some of the methodological weeds. And this is, I think, some of the value of qualitative research, the value of qualitative research. I put together something called the World Regret Survey, where I invited people around the world to submit their biggest regret. And we ended up with an incredible collection of over 20,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. 20,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. It's really amazing. And what I found, when you actually read through the regrets, you don't have people slot them into the existing categories, but I actually read through and listen to the language that with remarkable consistency around the world, people seem to have the same four regrets, And I want to tell you what those regrets are. The first category are what I call foundation regrets. Foundation regrets, let me give you an example of these. Foundation regrets sound like this. Here's an example. I regret not saving money. This is a 43-year-old man from Tennessee. I regret not saving money diligently ever since I started working. It's nearly crushing every day to think about how hard I've worked for the last 25 years or so, but financially, I have nothing to show for it. Foundation regrets are small decisions we make early in life that accumulate to negative consequences later in life. And here's where it's an interesting example where the domain doesn't matter so much. It could be about education. We've got lots of people saying, I wish I had worked harder in school and university. We have lots of people saying, as this guy said, I wish I had saved more money and spent less frivolously. We have lots of people who have regrets about their small health decisions that accumulate. So foundation regrets sound like this. If only I'd done the work. The second category of regret are what I call boldness regrets. And these are an interesting example. Of of how these regrets transcend domains. So let me give you a few examples of this, and then I'll pay it off. So here's a 37-year-old man from Ireland. He says, I met the most amazing woman in college and never had the courage to ask her out. So that's a romance regret. Here's a man from the UK, 53-year-old man from the UK. He says, I haven't been bold enough in my work life. I've focused on not failing rather than succeeding. Here's a 40-year-old woman from Norway, says, not trusting myself to go for the dream of starting my own business. Now, here's why looking at this deep structure of regret is powerful. If I have lots of regrets around the world, like the guy from Ireland, where people say, X years ago, I met a man or woman who I really liked. I wanted to ask him or her out on a date. But I was too chicken to do that, and I've regretted it ever since. That's a romance regret. I have lots of regrets, a surprising number from university graduates saying they wish they had studied abroad when they were in university. That's an education regret. I have lots of regrets, as the ones that you see here, where people say, I wanted to start a business, I wanted to go out on my own, but I ended up staying in this lackluster job, and I regret that. That's a career regret. But to my mind, all of those regrets are the same. Powering them underneath is the exact same regret. You're at a juncture. All these regrets begin at a juncture. You can play it safe, or you can take the chance. You can play it safe, or you can take the chance. And when people play it safe, not always, but more than you would expect, they regret it. When they fail to take that chance, they regret it. And this is consistent with some of my own research, as well as previous research in social psychology, showing that overwhelmingly, people have regrets of inaction over action. When I did the quantitative part of my survey, my quantitative survey of the US population, I was really looking for demographic differences. And the demographic differences in regret were very few. Far fewer than I expected. But the one demographic difference that was powerful in the quantitative survey of the US population was age. When people were young, they have roughly equal numbers of action regrets and inaction regrets, roughly equal numbers of regrets about what they did versus regrets about what they didn't do. But as people age, the inaction regrets take over. When you're in your, very quickly, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, inaction regrets dominate, sometimes by a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. So boldness regrets sound like, boldness regrets sound like this. If only I'd taken the chance. If only I had taken the chance. Let's go to the third category, moral regrets. Moral regrets are, again, you begin at a juncture. You can do the right thing, you can do the wrong thing. And when we do the wrong thing, most of us, not all of us, but I think most of us, like 99% most of us, regret it when we actually betray our values, when we don't do what we're supposed to do. We might feel a short-term exhilaration in that, but over time, because I think that we're actually moral animals and we want to do the right thing. And so at these junctures where you can do the right thing or you can do the wrong thing, people do the wrong thing, they regret it. So specifically, you have a lot of regrets like this one here. I was stunned at how many regrets you have like this. Here's a 37-year-old man from Canada. He's from Canada, who says, I regret bullying a few different kids in my grade growing up. When I think back on it, I cringe, and I can't help but wish for a chance to go back and change it. Lots of regrets about bullying, lots of regrets about marital infidelity. Moral regrets sound like this: only I'd done the right thing. Fourth and final category are connection regrets. Here is a classic example of a connection regret. This is from a 47-year-old woman from California. She says, I deeply regret not reaching out to a childhood friend when she was fighting cancer. When I finally called her home, I learned she had passed away earlier that morning. Connection regrets are about relationships, and actually not mostly about romantic relationships, about the full spectrum of relationships in our lives. You had relationships that were intact or should have been intact, and they come apart. And the way that a lot of these relationships come apart is profoundly undramatic. I mean, I agree that we should sort of model some of our behavior on Netflix and look at, data about individual preferences and whatnot. But if you look at how these relationships come apart, most of them would make terrible Netflix series. You couldn't even get a pilot out of it because they're so undramatic. They drift apart rather than come apart cataclysmically. It's not like an Edward Albee play. They're not throwing plates at each other or anything like that. They are just slowly drifting apart. And what happens is one person wants to reach out. They say, oh, it's going to be really awkward to reach out. And besides, the other side's not going to care. So they don't do anything and the drift widens. And so connection regrets sound like this: if only I'd reached out. Now, I think these regrets are interesting. I want to make one last point before we bring Rory back on here for some questions. I think that these four regrets, foundation regrets, boldness regrets, moral regrets, connection regrets, which occur with remarkable similarity all over the world based on this mammoth sample of 20,000 regrets from all over. If I were to put this database on the screen and show you the regret, but black out the field that showed where the regret came from, I don't think that you could tell whether the person responding was a 32-year-old man from here in Washington, D.C., or a 58-year-old woman from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. There's a remarkable universality and consistency here. I think that's very, very interesting. But as I probed this, I thought there was something else going on, which is this: that these regrets are telling us something. They're telling us something really important, that when people reveal what they regret the most, they are telling you what they value the most. Let me say that one more time. When people tell you what they regret the most, they're telling you what they value the most. If you do something or don't do something 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's still bugging you today, that's important. That's a signal. That is meaningful data there. And so these four core regrets operate as a photographic negative of the good life. That when people tell you what they regret the most, they're telling you what they value the most. And so these four core regrets give us clues about what people ultimately want out of their lives. And so we can look at these regrets, and each of them seems to surface a fundamental human need. So foundation regrets: if only I'd done the work. I think that reflects our need for stability. A good life is not precarious. A good life is not wobbly. A good life has some stolidity behind it. It's not uneven. It's not, we have some footing in it. So foundation regrets reveal our need for stability. Boldness regrets. You know what? I think at a certain point, we all realize that we are on this planet for a vanishingly short amount of time. And at a certain point, we say to ourselves, when am I going to do something? When am I going to learn? When am I going to grow? When am I going to contribute? That the clock is ticking in some way. We don't necessarily think about that consciously all the time, but we want to do something. And so boldness regrets are ultimately about our fundamental need for growth and learning. Moral regrets, as I said before, and I'm happy to take questions about this, because morality is interesting, because I think we have a more or less consensus on what constitutes boldness. We don't have a pure consensus on what constitutes moral behavior. But when it comes to individual moral decisions, when we breach our own moral code, most of us, and I mean like almost everyone, feels crappy about it. And sometimes that crappiness lingers, which suggests that we have a need for goodness. And finally, we have connection regrets, which I think are ultimately about love. And not only about romantic love, but about the full expression of love that we have for ourselves, for our families, for our kids, for our parents, for our colleagues, for our friends. I think we're in some ways under-indexed understanding of the importance of, say, companionate love, on a wider, more robust, expansive notion of what love is. One last point before I wrap up is right. Okay, if this is what people want out of their lives, then why would they not want it out of the part of their lives that they're at work? If I'm more right than wrong, let's just stipulate for 30 seconds that I am, that these regrets reveal what people most want out of life, then why would they not want it out of their work life? And so these four regrets give us clues, give leaders clues about how to build organizations in which people can do their best work and be their best selves, and where people can do their best work because they can be their best selves. So what we've got here is so foundation regrets. If only I'd done the work. People need fair pay and predictability. Again, some solidity and stability to their work lives. Boldness regrets, psychological safety, to experiment, to learn and grow. I have hundreds of regrets around the world of people who said, I wish I had spoken up. I should have said something. I wish I had spoken up. That's not only on them. That's about being in an environment where they didn't have the psychological safety to speak up. They didn't have the psychological safety to experiment, to try stuff, to be bold. Moral regrets. I am convinced that the most talented people in the workplace, they want to work for great organizations, but they also want to work for good organizations. They want to work for organizations that have a degree of purpose, that are noble, that are honest, that are transparent. And finally, connection regrets. One reason we work is for the sense of belonging and friendship and affinity, and that is profoundly important. And so, as I wrap up here, in this weird way, we have this emotion, regret, that we find aversive, that we don't like. It's unpleasant. And so our first instinct is to try to avoid it, is to try to say, I don't have any regrets, is to never look backward, is to sort of squelch any negativity and always be positive. And this emotion, this profoundly misunderstood emotion, gives some profoundly important clues about what makes life worth living. That the regret gives us, I think, a pathway to a life well lived and to organizations that allow people, as I said a moment ago, to be their best selves and do their best work. So with that, let me stop and bring back my old friend Rory for a few questions.
Well, that is an absolute joy. And I have to say, I certainly can't accuse you of a lack of boldness in that you've introduced a book about regret effectively to the self-help shelf of American bookshops. And it'll be really interesting to see how the book sells, because you can't really give the book as a present, because what's it saying if you give someone a book about regret? And is it likely that when you're surrounded by books going basically how deranged optimism is the secret for life and happiness and success, that people will actually pick out a book with such an incredible outlier thesis? Nonetheless, I think you may be very largely right. I mean, one, the fact that it's universal suggests that it evolved, and the fact that it evolved suggested it evolved for a reason. That's one really interesting thing, I think. Whether it's miscalibrated for the modern era is a question worth asking, I think. But I think your taxonomy of regret, your fourfold taxonomy of regret, is really, really fabulous. I mean, it's more or less all-encompassing, is it? That pretty much every regret you came across fitted neatly into one of those four categories.
Most of them. I mean, I don't want to overstate that every single regret out of those 20,000 fit perfectly into those categories. You have some that maybe that straddle categories. You have some that are a little bit more idiosyncratic. But I appreciate your initial comment, Rory, because you know what? If it's obviously. I mean, we know this from the research in nudging. It's a lot easier to confirm people's existing biases than it is to challenge their biases, and so. And as a writer and as a human being, I play the long game. And so there's a reason why in this book, we use the R word and we put it in big capital letters at the center. Yeah. We're trying to challenge the prevailing wisdom because the prevailing wisdom is wrong. I mean, if I can use this word, the prevailing wisdom is, forgive the phrase, bullshit. All right. To me, the definition of bullshit is something that is demonstrably untrue and dangerous if you believe that falsehood. And so to me, that the philosophy of no regrets, that we should be positive all the time, that we should never look backward, is misguided, unscientific, and not a pathway to a life well lived.
So you can see at a very simple evolutionary level, okay, if I go and eat some strange coloured berries and I'm very shortly afterwards taken ill, then the feeling of regret for having risked the berries undoubtedly will then discourage me from repeating the action. And there are some schools of thought, I think, in the decision sciences which suggest that regret avoidance is the fundamental kind of decision-making heuristic. There were two people at the University of Essex, I think, called Looms and Tooby, if I'm right, who wrote extensively about this. I've always had a long belief that mainly consumers pay a premium for brands as a form of regret minimization. In other words, brands don't guarantee perfection or optimization, but they do guarantee a lower variance outcome, which means you're less likely to regret having bought them, for example. And so, Daniel Kahneman, of course, did some research suggesting that you regret missing a train or a flight by 10 minutes much more than you regret missing it by half an hour. So there are some strange, in short-term regret, there are some strange kind of inconsistencies there. Even though the outcome is the same, the amount of emotional pain you'll suffer from narrowly missing something is very different from missing something by miles.
Right, right. Actually,
sorry.
Dan Gilbert did a lot of that research in literally in subway stations in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he saw that effect. One of the things that happens, Rory, when we anticipating regret is sometimes a useful heuristic, but it also can lead us astray. I have a whole chapter on that. And what it does sometimes is that when we anticipate regret, we sometimes make decisions that are not optimal decisions, but that actually are simply risk aversive decisions. And those are not always the same thing. We sometimes will buy emotional insurance that we don't need, and that can lead to suboptimal. You see this in the glorious research on people taking multiple choice tests and deciding whether they should switch an answer when they think they've gotten it wrong. And what the evidence shows overwhelmingly is that you should switch your answer. Most people are much more likely to switch from a wrong answer to a right answer, but people don't switch their answer because the perspective pain of switching from a right answer to a wrong answer is so great, and the perspective pain of sticking with a wrong answer is so modest that they make a suboptimal choice.
So the Monty Hall problem might be partly explained by regret aversion, that you're too unwilling.
The Monty Hall problem is absolutely right. Pick the other door.
Pick the other door.
Pick the other door. That is a powerful life lesson here from the research on decision making. It took me 5 years to understand the math underneath the Monty Hall problem, but the punchline was very clear. Pick the other door. Switch doors. If you're for those of you students out there taking multiple choice tests, the evidence is overwhelming. If you think you should switch your answer, switch your answer. Over time, you're going to get more answers right by switching.
So that's very interesting. I mean, I've got two questions here. Quite a lot of the questions do argue, a few of the questioners acknowledge that this can actually inform our future decision making very, very well. There are a few people who argue, I think rightly, that it can be toxic in that, for example,
absolutely,
you could use it to explain all the bad things that happened to your life. Now, the girl you didn't chat to in college, there's also, I think, a danger that you automatically assume that the alternate course would have been better, whereas that girl you didn't chat to in college might have ended up burning all your clothes and crashing your car. It's very, very easy to assume an optimal alternative, and that could be dangerous. The other question I got twice, actually, is what's your biggest regret? Ours is not checking the slides, so we will be absolutely certain next year that we will rigorously check the formatting of all slides. But in your case, quite a few people have asked, and you can refuse to answer if you wish.
I absolutely will embrace the answer to that, but let me take the first one.
Of course.
All right. What's interesting about that? Okay, so for two points on that first one. Number one, what the research shows is that we basically for a British audience, we have to Tony Blair our regret. All right. There's a third way. All right. We shouldn't ignore it. All right. That's the predominant view. But wallowing in our regrets is an equally bad idea. What we should be doing is using our regrets as a signal, all right? And there's systematic ways to do that. And as you noted in sort of implicitly in that really brilliant deep dive you had for Dove, is that we have a problem, especially among young people, with negative emotions. Young people are being brought down by negative emotions because what happens is we haven't equipped them with ways to deal with negative emotions. And there's a systematic way to deal with regret, to use it, not to ignore it, not to wallow in it, but to use it as an engine for progress. We have science-based techniques to confront our regrets and enlist them. That's profoundly important. If we go either way, it's going to be bad. If we ignore them, that's bad. If we wallow in them, that's bad. That's bad too. Second point on the idea that people are spinning fantasies about what might have been. I collected regrets from 20,000 people. They had the option to opt in for follow-up interviews. When I interviewed people, and there's a guy in the book who embodies that. When people talk about, say, not asking somebody out on a date, they actually do not spin out glorious scenarios of a perfect life because they did that. What bothers them, what vexes them is in the moment they didn't step up. That is the source of their pain. It's less about spinning a fantasy of the resulting counterfactual life they could have led and more about sort of their own lack of gumption in that moment. Finally, to your final question, my biggest regrets. I have lots of regrets, like everybody else. And I have a lot of regrets about kindness earlier in my life, where I was in situations when I was a younger man in university, even secondary school, university, early in the workplace. I was never a bully, but I was in many situations, Rory, where I saw people not being treated well, people being excluded, people being mistreated. And it wasn't like I didn't see it. I saw it. It wasn't like I didn't know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't do anything. And so it's a regret of inaction dealing with kindness. And it has bothered me for 10, 20, 30 years. Now, to wrap this up, I could ignore that, say, no regrets. You can't change the past. It doesn't matter. Or I could say, oh my God, I'm the worst person in the world. I'm a horrible human being. Or I can say, wait a second. The fact that this has stuck with me for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years is a signal. It's a signal about what I value, kindness, and it's instruction about what I should do in the future. So now if you look at my behavior based on that, if I'm in a situation where someone is being mistreated, I speak up now. Well, I didn't do that for the first 45 years of my life. When I'm in a situation where I see someone being excluded, I do my very best to bring them in. And so this is how we can use this misunderstood emotion as a way to work smarter and ultimately to live better.
Treated as a servant, I think that's an extraordinary thing. I've been slightly immunized about regret because in 1995 I worked with a very brilliant creative director, an American who decided to come to London to work for Ogilvy rather than starting a business with his mate. His mate was called Jeff Bezos. So by comparison with him, I can gloriously say he's gone on to lead an incredibly varied and interesting life. So I'm very, very happy for that. But by contrast with that, I don't have anything really to match it. But that has been fantastic and a complete eye-opener, almost equivalent. The only other book that has made me reconsider something so much is Syrian Sumner's book about wasps, where she actually suggests that wasps are actually rather important to the environment and we shouldn't really be quite so mean to them. So that is the second book of the year. I think you should sell them actually as a joint set, a book on regret and a book on wasps. That has been absolutely fantastic, Dan, and I can't wait to meet again. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Just one favour. If you want to keep Nudgestock free, click the like button because the algorithm likes it, and click the subscribe button too. The algorithm likes that, and unlike the like button, it's actually useful because you'll get notified of future content from Nudgestock whenever it becomes available.